We are rocking and rolling. All right, Anna, welcome.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you guys for coming. I'm so excited that people are here to hear about paleo stuff. Yeah, so let's see, I'm a third year PhD student at Scripps. And my research in grad school is basically about fossil corals and what we can learn from them in terms of ecology and also climate. I do some work with modern coral too, so I do a lot of like sort of thinking about past and present and how different timescales can inform each other. And before that, I guess I'll go to this. Before that, I worked at a bunch of places. I was super privileged to be able to work at a bunch of cool places. So I spent some time. Lafayette was my undergrad. It's like the best department ever. I loved it. And then I was able to work with the USGS and some other organizations that sort of work on different time scales too. So yeah, I'm really fortunate to have this sort of perspective of the modern and the past that I think is really fun. I did a lot of work in undergrad with paleobotany, so a lot of like what we can learn from fossil plants and sort of pollen about like ecology and climate and things like that too. So yeah, that's sort of where I'm coming from. The bottom, these photos at the bottom are some silly photos of some of the students, the undergrad students here at UCSD in the field classes that I've been TAing. Yeah, so that's just sort of what I've been up to here. This is in the Mojave Desert in the field geology class. Um, and
We
I
got a
also,
question in the chat, a shout out for Easton,
oh,
Pennsylvania.
oh my God, heck yeah. Who's from Easton? That's amazing. Sorry, I can't see the chat when I'm screen sharing. That's awesome.
I
Um,
graduated Lafayette in 1990.
you're kidding. That's
No,
amazing. I love Lafayette. Oh my God, Lafayette is my favorite.
another time. We'll talk it later.
Okay. Um, yeah, oh my God, I love that department. It introduced me to geology and was like the best thing ever for me. But anyway, um, yeah, and then I also put photos here of two of my hobbies just for fun, which are watercolor painting and I like to bake. Uh, I like to bake a lot, and this was an attempt that I made to bake the Grand Canyon. But anyway, yeah, that's my sort of background, where I'm coming from. A lot of sort of fossil and modern ocean and fossil and modern plant info. Okay, let's see. So. Um, our sort of plan for today, for this afternoon is we'll talk about sort of why paleo topics matter for the present and future of sort of our planet, climate, ocean, life triangle. And then we'll talk about how paleo research happens, what our tools are. So we'll talk about stuff like corals, plants, but also ice, chemistry, bio, yeah, different things. Um, and then we'll walk through a few case studies and some exercises in paleo sort of climate analysis and how we can learn from the fossil record. And then we'll go over some additional resources as well. Yeah, so let's see. So first, for how or for why paleontology matters and why we're all here. So the IPCC has a paleoclimate section now, which is really cool. And yeah, I guess I'm wondering before we even start if people have thoughts on like why the IPCC would have like why there would be a chapter on paleoclimate in this report. Um,
You
yeah.
can come off mic and say we're a small group, so feel free to come off mic and say things.
The first thing I'm going to think of is that there are so many ups and downs in climate over the last 600,000 years. So being able to recognize that the cycles are natural, but what's been happening recently is unnatural. At least that's what I've been showing my students. So that's where I camp out in that question right now.
Yeah, totally. Yep. Yeah, anybody else want to say anything, or I can go on if not, but that totally is it.
Would it be like putting together some other information as far as maybe like what plant life was around, what other conditions were for the amount of various gases in our atmosphere, something like that, to look for more connections?
Yeah, so both totally correct. So basically, yeah, I mean, Earth has been around for like 4.6 billion years, right? And so like it's just added context for why modern human-caused climate change has such like horrifically bad implications. So yeah, it really is sort of just there's been a wider there's sort of a wider array of examples to look at that give us further context for that. So let's see. Yeah, so these are all just sort of a bunch of modern climate data, right? This is like the past few decades of climate change. But these records, these observational or instrumental records, only go back on a decadal, like on like a few decades scale. So with the paleo record, we can look back farther than that. So yeah, we'll talk about why that's important. But this I just put in, you know, I mean, we all know all of the risks of modern climate change. And yeah, so this is basically what we were just saying. So these are both by this really awesome artist who I love a lot that some of you may have come across before. His name is Ray Troll. I'm sort of obsessed with him. He's like a paleo enthusiast. He's like more than an enthusiast, but anyway, he's amazing. He's this brilliant artist and paleo guy in Alaska, and there's a lot of his art scattered throughout here. I think it sort of helps make paleo really accessible and fun, so I have a lot of that. But yeah, basically just showing that, you know, Earth formed 4.6 billion years ago. This is a version of the geologic timescale, and yeah, overall just how paleo timescales are super important to integrate into climate education because they offer so much more context. And a common argument, I think, that people make is like, oh, well, climate has changed before over time, right? But by actually looking at these past climate changes and things like their rates and their scales and their magnitudes, it actually is more evidence about why modern climate change is so problematic. So yeah, that anyway, this is sort of a timescale that we'll return to throughout the talk. So, okay, why does the paleo realm matter? So these are the sort of three main areas that we'll talk about. So the first one is sort of biological. So it's to understand things like evolution and where we come from, but also sort of ecosystem response to change. So we'll talk about biology a bit. And then the next two are more climate. So to understand basically how the whole system, like how the whole Earth system functions. Because the sort of, you know, there are some things we can learn from modern climate and ocean studies. But again, just further context of how these are related, we get from the paleo record. And then also relevant issues of modern climate change that relate to the first 2 points call for this sort of more comprehensive, long-term historical perspective, because it's just added context here. So the first one, talking about sort of evolution, biology, and response to changes. So one thing that I want to say a little bit is that we can see basically how life responds to big changes in the past through the fossil record. So this is one example. The little arrow is pointing out where we are on here in time. So this is the end Permian. This was the most massive extinction on the planet to date. It was like, I think the actual numbers are like 97 or 90 something percent of marine species and 70 something percent of terrestrial, something like that, went extinct at the end of the Permian. It happened in 200,000 years, which is like really geologically fast. And it was crazy high amounts of carbon dioxide, but below the modern rate. Anyway, so this is an artist's depiction on the bottom that is very dramatic. But yeah, so this is super important for us because looking at this transition in time, this sort of Permian to Triassic through time, is sort of a slice of time in which CO2 was off the charts and things were happening like ocean acidification, sea surface temperatures were rising. So things were happening then that are also happening now. And so we can use warm times in Earth history to sort of see what happened to communities then and see what happened to the planet then, and then think about how that could apply to the modern. Yeah, and there is this field that is sort of relatively recent that's called conservation paleobiology. The phrase that I really like from this professor at U Chicago is putting the dead to work. So yeah, basically they sort of use this idea that the past has a much wider range of environmental conditions. And so we can see examples of how species and ecosystems have responded to a whole diversity of changes in the past. And we can use this as, I mean, this is an experiment, and you can see the results of the experiment in the fossil record. And so, yeah, there's sort of an example here that I will briefly mention with these fossil plants and traces of insect damage. So in conservation paleo and thinking about how to apply it to the modern, they sort of talk about how there's three ways that life can respond to changes in its environment, right? So it can move, it can adapt, or it can go extinct. And so one example of this is during this one warm period in Earth history, there was an increase in the frequency and diversity of insect damage. So how like basically insects were eating and damaging plants more when it was warmer. And so there's this correlation between insect outbreaks on crops and warming. And so this can sort of be applied to, what is the impact that insect and sort of pest problems are going to have on crops as our climate continues to warm. And so we can sort of look at the relationship here and think about what this will mean for our food systems and things like that. So yeah, that was one example of how that can be applied. Another conservation paleo example is this was a paper about corals in Western Australia, and basically comparing the ranges of sort of where corals lived in the Pleistocene versus in the modern, and sort of figuring out that coral taxa that are present in modern communities expand or contract their geographic ranges in response to climate. And so this is something that we can use. We can say, oh, well, if this species of coral does this when the climate does this, then we can use that to try to figure out like, oh, well, where should we plant more coral or where should we do this? And so another example of how paleo can inform conservation. Yeah, so there's a bunch more examples, but those are just two that I thought would be useful, that we can talk more about if people are interested. But the third point about bio that I wanted to make is maybe the most obvious, but this reason of importance of the fossil record is just learning about where we came from, evidence for evolution, helping us understand how life evolves. And one example of how paleo really helps us here that I really love is the story of Tiktaalik, and Neil Shubin, the guy who made this discovery. It was actually just here at Scripps, and I like saw the email that he was giving a talk, and I like lost my mind. Anyway, it was a really cool talk if anybody got to see it. But basically, this is an example of the fossil record. I'll play the. Oh, it doesn't work. But anyway, this is an example of figuring out the link, or one of the links between fish and people and all sort of tetrapods, because that was sort of unclear. And then this professor Neil Shubin from University of Chicago made this discovery of this sort of fish that could push itself up onto its limbs in the Canadian Arctic, and all animals that descended from these, including us, are tetrapods. And so just sort of the very basic but important fact that from the fossil record we learn about our own past. This is another Ray Troll drawing that that I love, that says embrace your inner fish because we all come from fish. I think Chuck E.D. is Charles Darwin. Okay. Let's see. So yeah, after this, I think we are going into climate, into more of the climate side of things now. But yeah, if people want to talk more about conservation, paleo, bio, we definitely can do that now or at the end as well. But yeah, I guess I'll just go into climate. Okay. So to understand how the Earth system works, again, we have this sort of relatively short-term instrumental and observational record, but that's just a few decades. And so the paleo record has this wider span of time, and we can learn more about what the different time constraints are to different parts of the climate system. So yeah, really it can show sort of how quickly everything can change. And one important distinction here is that is sometimes overlooked is the difference between climate change and climate variability. So we know that like weather is sort of a daily scale thing and climate is more of a long-term thing. It's sort of a similar relationship. So climate variability is it's more like shifts in climate from natural processes that are on these sort of shorter time scales. So like seasons up to like maybe a few decades. So an example of this is El Nino. This is something that the climate system just does on its own. And this is sort of as opposed to climate change, which is more of a long-term trending situation, timescales of sort of decades to millennia, like tens of, yeah. And so paleoclimate archives, like different types of paleoclimate archives of different resolution, help us look at, like some help us look at variability and some help us look at climate change. And some can do both. So yeah, so the first thing here, so climate variability, yeah, there's a bunch on here, but basically the point of looking at climate variability, or I guess one important point about it is that having a longer baseline of what the Earth system does without anthropogenic input is useful to understand like how modern climate change is shifting things. And so because some trend might just be like some part of variability or not. And so if we isolate this, we can sort of figure that out more. And so here are this graph is showing basically some shifts that can happen on a few different timescales. So these trends basically add context to whatever other changes in climate that you're looking at. So you'll see on the two farthest left, the vertical, the age is in millions of years, but the two on the right are in just years. And so, yeah, different patterns having different timescales, and just how important it is to understand that so that we can isolate signals and isolate out what anthropogenic climate change is. Yeah. Okay. And then this is much longer. This is a much longer time frame. So this is going back to the modern is on the far right-hand side of the screen. And this is going back to the end of the Cretaceous. So that you can see the meteorite impact is like the farthest left. And it's basically showing shifts in temperature on the top. And we'll talk about how we get this record, but basically paleoclimate on longer timescales teaches us why these shifts happen, what drives all the peaks and valleys, what controls our environment over a long period of time. And you can see some variability in here. It's sort of like the really, really lower or higher resolution sort of peaks and valleys in there. Some of that is variability, but the overall trends in there, like the red line, is change in climate over Earth history. And this is yes.
I didn't mean to interrupt you,
No,
Anna.
that's okay.
But I'm curious about the previous slide, looking at the effects of different influences on global temperature and tectonic in this case. Is that referring to volcanic activity, or can you just help us understand what tectonic means in this context?
Yeah. So in terms of influences on sort of Earth's climate in general, there totally is an impact by volcanism. There's an impact by life, like life can in turn impact climate. There's an impact by ocean circulation and also weathering of continents. And so tectonic, in this case, that's a good question. I think that in this case, tectonic is more referring to sort of like weathering of continents, and that can play a role because of sort of all of the stuff that enters the ocean, all of the silicates that enter the ocean. And so when tectonics are shifting, depending on sort of where, I think tectonic sort of is referring to where the ocean can circulate and how much weathering is happening from land to the ocean, because the sort of chemistry of what stuff is entering the ocean can play a role, and also sort of like where ocean circulation is happening as well. Yeah, and then
Based on the geography of those ocean basins and the arrangement of continents.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And then orbital is everything on the right, so that the tilt, eccentricity, and precession. So that's more like position of the Earth. Yeah. And then, there also can be things like a meteorite impact, or other things like that. But Okay. So yeah, the third sort of point that I have here is just that understanding these changes and variabilities over time isn't just useful for its own sake, but for understanding of modern climate issues as well. So what I have in bold here at the bottom, basically just that the paleo record helps prove that our activities are not too minor to impact the planet. I feel like people say, you hear sometimes like, oh, well, we haven't even been here that long. Like, how can we possibly have an impact on Earth's climate? But the paleo record actually proves that we are impacting the planet. Yeah, this is also a figure from the IPCC report, though not the most recent, but basically showing that models can be used for reproducing temperature observations, but only if they can combine sort of known causes with, or known natural causes with human forces. And so basically here, that sort of green bar is the natural causes at the bottom. And so we really have to be able to isolate what those are as opposed to what the red, those human causes are. And yeah, having a longer paleo record helps us to do that. So this basically is our geologic backdrop for modern climate change. So during the past million, this graph is going back about 1 million years. Again, modern is on the right. And this is from 2013, as you'll see. So it's like way higher than it was in 2013 now for our ppm. But yeah, over the past 1 million years, we can see here the temperature is in blue and the CO2 is in orange. And you can see how they're correlated. And basically, we have these sort of cycles between warm and cold. And until the past century, we have non-human factors causing these shifts between about like 175 and 300 ppm. And we see that warmer times are higher CO2, and that at no time in the past 800,000 years has Earth's atmospheric CO2 been anywhere as near as high as it is today. So we see that global temperatures here have risen from the coldest to like near the warmest levels of our current interglacial period in the last century. And for some context too here, this graph, so the sort of 80-ish ppm rise in CO2 at the end of the like past ice ages generally took about 5,000 years or more. But the higher rise of like 120 or so that we see today has happened over a century. So yeah, like we see that rate being a lot faster. Yeah, so this is basically the exact same thing, just showing that there's always been this evidence of global heating and cooling, primary argument made by people who are questioning climate change, but it's the rate and knowing what this variability context is that matters and that proves our impact. And then I have a few things here to talk about sort of how we can use it, like how we can sort of use these records and how they can be applied to other things as like in the context of climate change. So this is just one example. This graph is sort of complicated, but this basically is showing El Nino, and then this is through coral records. And this basically is showing how El Nino has changed in strength. So how the pattern of El Nino has changed in strength over the past 7,000 years in coral records. And we can look at things like how has this happened alongside sort of changes in other things, changes in climate or changes in coral health or whatever. And we can use things like this to inform how El Nino will continue to change going forward. So yeah, that's one example. Another one is we can learn about what's going to happen with sea level. So this is a pretty straightforward message from the paleoclimate record. So on the left is a coral in the ocean. On the right is an uplifted coral reef. I think that one is in Aruba. I stole that picture from my advisor's slide, but I think that one's in Aruba. And so those were the sort of, corals that grew 125,000 years ago. But now they're, a few meters above sea level. So from things like this, we can basically see proof that something melted the last time Earth was as warm as it was today, whether it's like part of Antarctica or Greenland, something had melted. And by looking at sort of volume and height above the sea level now, you can people can figure out like, was it Greenland? Was it this? Was it, but basically proof of what happens to ice when the Earth is as warm as it is today. Yeah. And then I have two more examples. So this is one that I thought would be interesting. It's sort of in our own backyard. And I've been thinking about it. I added this really recently because I'm thinking about it because I'm having a conversation about my advisor about doing with my advisor about doing a side project about something with this. But we basically we have, basically all of our year-round freshwater supply is from the snowpack in the Sierras in Southern California. And this is super sensitive to climate warming. And so the water stress here is only going to get worse. And so understanding how the snowpack and precipitation and drought have varied in the Sierra Nevada over the past millennium, and looking at sort of what the hydroclimate variability is here is super important to mitigate water shortages for Southern California. And so to understand sort of what the risks of drought are in the West, we need to understand what that baseline of variability is beyond the instrumental, and extend farther back. So that's one that I think is kind of cool. And then this is similar to what we were talking about with conservation paleobio, but this is looking at climate records. In this case, it's pretty recent. It's going back 2,000 years, and looking at those alongside pollen. So A is temperature anomaly, and then C and D are both metrics of pollen, basically. And so you can sort of track biodiversity change alongside climate using these records together, which is pretty cool. And you can see how humans have through temperature, not like temperature changes or land use and things like that have influenced changes in North American forests through pollen, which is interesting. Yeah, so I think we're gonna get into tools and things like that. If that sounds okay, or do you want to?
Great. And anything you can lean into in terms of things that might inspire use of some of these figures and the work in classrooms, that would be great. And I'm going to share your slides because there might be some things that participants might want from these slides. I'm assuming that's okay, right?
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to drop the link in the chat for your slides right now.
Cool.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you guys have questions, you like people can stop me and interrupt and yeah. Okay. So I thought I mentioned a few of these, but I thought I would ask if people have ideas about what some paleo archives might be. So where we might find some of these paleo data points. About like what climate was like before.
Rock layers?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
Anna, you mentioned pollen, and I'm wondering if the pollen can be identified and used as a proxy for what plants grow best in what kinds of climates.
Yep, yep, that's exactly what they use it for. Yeah. Yep, pollen. Pollen is it sort of collects really well in lakes and offshore and things like that, and it'll just sink to the bottom. So if you have sediment cores of stuff, you'll find a lot of pollen in like lake sediment cores and things like that. Yeah.
When I worked at the Natural History Museum, we did an exhibit about foraminifera,
Mhm.
and the little, I guess, shells, if you will, that they make. And foraminifera are planktonic organisms in the ocean, and those shells would sink into the mud and could be used as a indicator for ocean temperature.
Yep. Yeah. So forams are something that we're going to talk about too. Um, so yeah, there's a bunch here. On the bottom left, these are in rock layers. So you see things like wood and different fossils preserved in rock layers. And then moving to the right, this is a sediment core. So stuff in the ocean will sort of fall to the bottom like forams and be preserved in a sediment core. There's tree rings, there's the layers of coral that grow accretionarily. There's ice, there's lots of stuff. Um, and you basically have all these different archives that you can get paleo data from. So here's an example of coral. This is what I am doing right now. So I'm getting a lot of nitrogen and other sort of chemistry data from fossil corals to figure out how nutrients in the ocean have changed over time with climate. And these are really, really high resolution because they grow like seasonally or yearly or things like that. Um, and then this is a lot of data on how ice cores can teach us things. Basically, air is trapped by the snow and then it gets compressed. And so you can have like 800,000-year-old air that's just trapped inside of ice. And then you can analyze the CO2 from that and figure out what the CO2 was. Um, and then this is an example of a sediment core proxy. So if we look, this is basically how they're drilled in the ocean. So you send down this ship that sort of looks like a drill ship. You send down a pipe and it comes back with this thing, which is a core of mud from the seafloor, and it ends up looking like this. And there's tons of things inside of here that you can look at. So you can sort of, there's fossils, there's minerals, there's pollen, there's wood and charcoal you can get a fire history from. Color even tells you a bunch of stuff. These are examples of what Nan was just talking about with forams. So these are tiny little single-celled organisms that are sort of everywhere in the ocean. And they can teach us tons of different things about climate signals. And I have one example of that here that I'll try to go through sort of quickly because I just noticed that it's 4:50, so I'm gonna try to go through this relatively fast. But yeah, this basically records how much sort of ice is on the planet based on the amount of different types of oxygen because they make their shells out of oxygen and other elements, but because there's oxygen incorporated into their shells, that tells us what the oxygen level in the ocean was at that time, and so we can figure out how much ice was on the planet based on the fossil shells of these little guys. And then if we piece all of those together at the bottom, these are all different sediment cores. And if we piece them all together, we can get a longer climate record too. Let's see. they also can tell us biological stuff. So this is before and after an extinction event in the ocean, as you can really tell. So we can see what survived and what didn't. Um, and this is on the right. These are fossil pollen bits that you can identify. So that's what you were talking about. And these are some fossil plants. And I'm actually going to skip a few of these slides, um, but I will briefly go through this. So basically leaf architecture. So like how many points are on are how many teeth are on a leaf and things like that can teach you what the climate was like, because those are correlated. And so things like, more teeth are, better suited for colder climates because teeth help with metabolizing sap. And so then you can sort of use that relationship and say, okay, so if they're toothier, it's colder. And that's also true for things like size. So think about like if you're, where would you see bigger leaves in a rainforest or like in Florida or in a North American forest. And so you can use things like that to figure out what the climate was like from leaves as well. And you input all these parameters and then you can reconstruct. And this is what I did for my undergraduate thesis work at Lafayette. And we had this fossil site in the Rocky Mountains, and it was this lake bed. And we figured out what the temperature was, which was pretty cool. Sorry for going so quickly through that. Let's see. Okay. Some case studies so that we can actually look at data, hopefully. So this is one time period that we're going to look at. It's an analog. It's also an analog for modern climate change. It's called the PETM. It's right here between the Paleocene and the Eocene, about 55 million years ago. And it's the time in Earth history that most closely resembles the current rate of atmospheric carbon dioxide. We can see it here in a sediment core too. It was an abrupt warming of several degrees Celsius in the ocean. And let's see. Yeah, so I have sort of one activity that, I mean, it's not my activity, it's the Smithsonian's activity, but I have the Smithsonian's activity, and then there's also another one that is 2 slides down that's a 4am-based activity. So Alec, I don't know, sorry, I went slowly. Do we have time to try to do these?
Yeah, well, this might be a good time to pause for,
Okay.
questions and ideas about how this might connect to different units and lessons that are taught in schools, and that way you can answer some of those questions, and then we can take a look at some of these activities, and then talk about some of the resources for supporting the teaching of paleo work with the subjects that they teach.
Okay, sounds good.
So, questions. Done my teacher pause time effectively. So if there are any other questions, Anna, do you think it would be effective for us to, one of the ideas that we talked about was going into breakout rooms and having one breakout room be based on one of these activities to explore, and then another breakout room based on the other activity. Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
All right. So maybe you could model what the activities are, and then we can put the links in the chat, and then we can let participants choose to go into one of those 2 rooms to
Sure.
explore.
Yeah, so the link for this one is at the bottom here, and then for this one is also at the bottom. But basically for this, you're looking at a warming event, and you're looking at some rocks from Wyoming before and after. So this is 55.8 million years ago, and on the right is 55.7. And so you'll look at the fossil plants from before and after this climate event, and you'll basically learn it's like a simple mathematic formula that you input the number of leaves with teeth versus not with teeth in, and then you get some climate data out from that, and you can assess what the change is. So you're basically sorting some leaves and then doing some basic math. And then you're thinking about how it relates or how it is different or similar to modern warming. And then this one is this one is sort of, I didn't as much think that you would do out all the math for this one because it's just a lot of math. But the idea of this is a type of foraminifera, of little tiny ocean creature that basically when water is cold, when the planet is cold, it forms its coils to the left, and when the planet is warm, it forms its coils to the right, which is really handy for us because we can look at them in a sediment core and basically look at the percentages of right coiling versus left coiling, and figure out what the climate was. And so this activity developed by this person at Berkeley basically is from some of her data, I think, and it's basically you have this plot, and you have, the number of right coiling, the number of left coiling, and you basically just add them up for the total and then calculate the percentages. And then I sort of put the final thing here, but you have your results here, and you can plot, age on one, and then you can pick, right coiling or left coiling. Here they did the right coiling, I think. And so, yeah. And so this shows you how the climate changed. And then if you look at a plot of the ice ages, basically it's showing you the ice ages. So this one is sort of done out. But yeah, those are the two. Sure, yeah. So one thing that I thought I would share, this is, this is something that I use a lot. This is basically how you find paleo data that you want to use for something. So if I'm looking for like, oh, like a couple days ago, I was like, oh, I wonder what's been done on fire history in the Sierras over time, and if people have looked at like charcoal in lakes in the Sierras over time. And so you can go to this website, and you can filter for like, this is just a screenshot, but you can see like fire history, or you can look up like different areas, and you can look at like Pacific coral to look at like El Nino over time and things like that. So if you're curious about like if you wanted to talk about Western water history, and you wanted a longer data set to use, and you wanted to like graph it or do something for it for class, you could look here, and it basically will give you whatever data over whatever time period people have collected it. So yeah, useful for if you're sort of wanting to do a case study analysis of anything. Let's see. This is just something that I've looked through before for like various outreach activities. And this is Carleton College's sort of database of paleontology activities. And there's tons. So, and some are paleo. They also have a climate thing that I did not screenshot, but yeah, they have some really cool resources here. And one thing that that we looked at a bit in other places where I've worked, but I think is less applicable here is this thing called the Digital Atlas of Ancient Life. But and it was cool because you sort of you could, you know, look at what fossils were in your backyard, but I don't know if they have much for California. So instead, this is cool. I sometimes use this just like for fun when I'm out hiking and I don't know what something is. But you can also like it's a thing that people can just like it's an app and you can like students can just download it for free on their phone. And yeah, they can just like see what's around them all the time. So I put an example here, just like when I was at my house, and you know, you can see, oh, I'm here. So I'm in rocks of this age, and there's a geologic map. And you can click on like here for example, I clicked on something at the National Monument at Point Loma, and it says the age of these rocks is Cretaceous, and here are the fossils that are inside of them, and that kind of stuff. So that can be a cool like what's in your backyard kind of resource. And it's free and yeah, they sort of just compile a bunch of different maps and things like that. Um, and
Share the app again, and maybe we can
oh,
drop.
sorry, it's called Rocked, but there's no E. It's at the top right of the slide. Um, yeah, ROCKD.
Uh,
Um,
Interesting.
yeah. I should know. I should figure out who actually runs it. I don't know, but
I'm gonna
yeah.
put the hyperlink in the chat for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also just fun for like when you're out hiking and you want to know what something is. Um, and then this is run by Cornell. So this is the Paleontological Research Institute up at Cornell, and they have tons of stuff. I put a bunch of links at the bottom here, but they have like resources for teaching about climate change. They have a lot of basic info about like what climate modeling is. That is really helpful for just understand like yeah, I mean even like yeah, it's just like it's really helpful for understanding how climate modeling works and what it is, and why it's useful. And they also have tons of paleo resources. They're a really cool paleo education center. Um, and then this one people maybe are familiar with. This, I mean, this is like, I think I learned about a bunch of paleo stuff on this in high school and college, but this is the Berkeley Evolution website. And I think it's cool too because as you go through sort of their like 101 on the website, it'll have like uh, activities and things like that listed as possible things and like what the grade levels are and stuff like that. So this is one example that I just put in here of like, you know, when you talk about phylogenetics and then there's activities of like, what did T-Rex, whatever, like, yeah. So that's a really awesome evolution website. Um, oh, I put this here because this actually was like, this was like, oh, sorry, wait, go back. This was one of my favorite things that I was stoked about when I first started to do paleo. It's an album. It's on Spotify. It's by Ray Troll and this band that he hangs out with, and it's called Cruising the Fossil Freeway. And sometimes my paleontology instructor at Lafayette would play this like at the beginning of classes, and we would all just like, anyway, it's really cool. And it's like there's a song called Ages of Rock where student like, you know, kids can like memorize or like, you know, learn what the different eras of the earth are. And it really is like one of my favorite things. And yeah, I think it's awesome. So yeah, weird resource, but it's cool. He's a really cool guy.
And what I'm gonna,
Um,
this is gonna be probably one of the bigger, more awesome produced blog posts following this event. We'll have these annotated and explained, and you'll have access to the stuff afterwards.
yeah. Yeah, I mean there's a bunch more resources, but those are sort of uh the ones that I found helpful. Um I had listed a few more that are that we'll share that are on a document, but um that is mostly everything. This is another piece of Rachel art that says the data is in the strata. Yeah. And then yeah, I don't know. Thank you all for listening to me talk about paleontology. And I stole some of these figures from my advisor's slides, so Chris and Dick Norris. So yeah, thanks to them. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. Really appreciate it. All right.